evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cross Border Talks, international relations seen from human and social perspective. Today, we are coming back to the issue of migration, a very painful, very controversial issue in the whole European continent. While the plight of Ukrainian refugees was in the center of international attention in the year 2022, we must not forget about other refugees who are still coming to Europe. Although we don't see the haunting images from Greece, Bulgaria, from the Mediterranean Sea in general, as often as we did before the pandemic, when the world's attention was centered on the Balkan route, it does not mean that the problem has disappeared. The migrants are still coming, they are still desperate, they are still dreaming of a better life in Europe, and Europe is still not ready to welcome them. We're going to discuss these issues with Rositsa Atanasova, who is working for Foundation for Access to Rights as Advocacy and Communication Expert. It's a Bulgarian organization offering legal aid to migrants and refugees, a Bulgarian organization. So, hello, Rositsa. Good evening. We are happy that you are with us today.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And before we come to our key topics, I would like to ask everybody listening to us to subscribe to Cross Border Talks. We are on SoundCloud, we are on Spotify, we are on YouTube, so you can either watch videos or just listen to our talks. I am sure you will not regret if you subscribe, so please do. And so I will be the co-host of today's episode together with Veronika Susova-Salminen, a Czech-Finnish journalist and expert on Eastern Europe. So, Rositsa, my first question would refer to Balkan route and how many refugees are going this way and what is happening there away from the world's attention. This question is partially inspired also by a report shown by Sky News, a media collaboration with different media, when they show really horrifying pictures of how the refugees were treated allegedly by the Bulgarian border police. People locked up in cages, people beaten up, everything, all this happens on the borders of Europe. So could you give us a bigger picture what is going on there?
Yes, I can give you the context about Bulgaria. So indeed, what we are seeing in the last few weeks is the attention of the media and the public being brought back to migration issues, unfortunately, because of some very tragic events. It seems like quite a few people are passing through Bulgaria and trying to transit to Western Europe. Of course, that has happened for a long time. This has always been the case. But what we are seeing now is that there have been some incidents also with policemen dying, trying to stop buses, in some cases migrants trying to smuggle other migrants. Of course, these are networks that have been functioning for a long time with, of course, the complicity of Bulgarian nationals as well. What has brought also the attention is some recent international coverage from the Bulgarian side. It was Maria Cheresheva who covered these incidents of people being detained in unofficial border police facilities and being driven back to Turkey without having any meaningful opportunity to ask for asylum. Some of them witnessed that they suffered injuries. In one particular case, a Syrian guy testified that he was shot at by the border police. Two other organizations we're partnering with, Mission Wings and Voice in Bulgaria, have also been very active in bringing attention to pushbacks in recent months.
So, do you think that this situation is deteriorating or it is a constant? I mean, has Bulgaria recently started treating migrants in particularly harsh way, or this is like a policy of the Bulgarian state for years?
We have been seeing violence and border violence and allegations of pushbacks for a long time. Long before these incidents now, there were several Human Rights Watch reports documenting and bringing attention to pushbacks on the Bulgaria-Turkey border. What we are seeing in terms of statistics is the numbers are maybe about 2 times higher of people being intercepted, irregularly entering, exiting, or residing or being on the territory of Bulgaria. So I can give you those numbers for this year. So from January to October of 2022, 14,427 people were intercepted inside the country, entering or exiting irregularly. This is 1.8 times higher than the same period of last year. So there's definitely an increase, even though these processes have been ongoing. I cannot say for sure if there has been an objective escalation in the violence. At the present time, we're really facing very uncertain situation politically inside the country. And maybe these sort of political changes are also influencing the treatment of migration. I cannot say objectively if there's more media attention much needed now to these issues, or there is some objective escalation in the violence. What we are seeing, what we have not been seen to this extent before, is that a lot of people are being removed from inside the country, even those who have been already in contact with some NGO who was trying to support them in their application for international protection. So it's easier to trace cases and have particular names of people who afterwards end up in Turkey, and we know for sure have been on the territory of Bulgaria without having been able to ask for international protection.
You actually mentioned now the international protection and the whole procedure. We often hear from the anti-immigration politicians in Europe the argument that refugees and migrants are coming to Europe illegally, and that means that they shouldn't be actually admitted in Europe or in the European Union. I would like to ask you about the context of this. Are there really some real possibilities for people, let's say now coming from the Middle East or from African countries, to really legally apply for asylum or for stay in Europe? And are these applications? How many of these applications are actually successful? Now we speak about the legal process of this.
Yes, thank you for this question. Unfortunately, for people coming from Syria, from Africa, they're very limited. I want to say virtually no legal pathways to enter the European Union. And the only way that they can ask for asylum is once they're in contact with authorities of the member state or on the territory of a member state. This is very different than the situation, say, of the Ukrainian refugees, who even before the war had the visa travel regime with the EU for up to 90 days. So they didn't really have this issue of accessing the territories. For all of the other refugees, access to the territory is a very big hurdle. There is no possibility, or it's left at the discretion of the member state. It's not regulated at EU level, but no EU member state, to my knowledge, uses this. There is no humanitarian visas for these people. On the contrary, what we are seeing a lot of member states doing, like Denmark attempted it, the UK before, well, now, but this was ongoing process before Brexit, was the outsourcing of asylum applications processing, or even any asylum obligations. So the idea that Denmark advanced some years ago was to process everyone outside of the EU and then only admit those that are eligible. Of course, there are a lot of issues with this process and how you can supply the same human rights standards and standards for the quality of the asylum procedure when that is not done in country. The way that currently Europe regulates this, which even led the UNHCR last year to say that the right to seek asylum, because there is no right of asylum in international law, but there is a right to seek asylum, has been rendered more and more meaningless, because through pushbacks and different sanctions that are imposed on carriers like air companies, it's virtually impossible for people, unless they pay to smugglers, to enter the EU for the purposes of seeking international protection. And it's very important to underline that in the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees, Article 31, it's not illegal to enter the territory, even if you enter illegally the territory of a state for the purposes of seeking protection, that should not be sanctioned.
In practice, however, as you said, many people who entered who entered and who wished to apply for international protection were pushed back. Could you tell us more about how the humanitarian organizations are trying to help those who entered, and were there any successful cases where people actually could apply for international protections and were allowed to stay in Bulgaria? I'm not, of course, asking for details or for names, but could you tell us approximately people from what countries were allowed to stay, and how many such cases are known to you?
When we are speaking about pushbacks, unfortunately, the practice is that most of these people are already returned before they have meaningful opportunity to ask for international protection. So in most cases, their identities, their countries of origin are not recorded. I think what is most effective right now, because in these cases it's very difficult to work and represent individual cases once the person is already returned, when the lawyer doesn't have a power of attorney. What we can do now is maybe be in touch with some people, and we have had contact of such individuals who have already been returned, and they tell us that they have been returned, but in this case we cannot meaningfully represent them. What we can do, I think, collectively as organizations, with the support of the media, is bring attention to this issue and scale up our advocacy efforts to bring attention to what's happening, that this is really a systemic issue that needs to be addressed, of how these people have meaningful access to the territory and meaningful access to the asylum procedure.
So actually, you already mentioned that the role of European Union in this is not very systemic, especially when you mentioned that there are no real instruments to legally enter from your country of origin to the European Union. There are some opinions or voices which are also claiming that the European Union is actually creating, especially in the West Balkan countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, basically refugee areas and pushback areas. Basically, it is outsourcing these countries for this. Do you agree with this opinion, or it's not true in your opinion?
In my opinion, there are several strands of EU policy that are at tension with each other. I think naturally, with the continuing operation of the Dublin regulation, there is no equal distribution of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers across the EU. Naturally, the southern and southeastern states like Bulgaria are the gateways to the European Union. And because of the operation of the Dublin regulation, the first state where you ask for asylum is the state that needs to, in the majority of cases, process your application. In one way, the EU has currently maybe the most generous asylum regime and the highest protection of human rights in the world. I dare say this is my personal opinion. So on one hand, there is pressure on the authorities, on the asylum authorities in Bulgaria, to improve the quality of the of the asylum procedure, and this relates to your previous question, we're still seeing very high percentage of rejections, particularly regarding certain nationalities, most notably Afghanistan. We have received recommendations and letters from the Commission saying that this practice needs to be rectified. Special attention in Bulgaria has also been drawn to the care and protection of unaccompanied children. So this is one strand of EU policy which is towards protection of human rights, protection of the rights of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. The other strand that runs counter that is the protection of the borders and migration control. Of course, we say that protection of the border is a matter of state sovereignty, and migration control is also a matter of state sovereignty. But we have a common border code for the whole union. So being a member state, we are part of that. And one of the big functions of Bulgarians, something that is brought up by our politicians often as a bargaining chip, is how well we are fulfilling this duty of protecting the border of the external border of the European Union. The very recent issue with all sorts of speculations why it didn't happen is that Austria and the Netherlands opposed Bulgaria finally becoming part of the Schengen space. And of course, the biggest hypothesis is that it has to do with migration control. Just the next few days, our president visited Greece and Turkey, and the most logical and natural topic of conversation was migration. So border control is a very important, a big topic. And in Bulgaria, and as you know, in Greece, it has been very well documented as well, Frontex is allegedly involved in some of the pushbacks, which is a EU agency, and this provoked a huge scandal with consequences for high leadership in the agency. So it is a very complex issue in terms of the different policies of the EU and how they run counter each other. The importance of protecting the border, the importance of returns as well. But what we are seeing in terms of returns is, and this kind of relates very closely to why border protection is so important and a lot of pushback practices are happening, is because once you have people enter the country and then the authorities decide that their claim is not substantiated and they receive a final rejection, there are many reasons why a person cannot be returned to their country of origin. What happens then is that there is a maximum term of immigration detention for the purposes of return. And once those 18 months are exhausted and this person cannot be returned, they're effectively left in the EU, in Bulgaria, in a legal limbo. So we're facing the issue of more and more people who are unreturnable. This is why, in my opinion, we try not to let the people come in the first place.
Mentioned that your president of Bulgaria is going to talk to these Turkish and Greek counterparts, and that migration will be the natural topic. What decisions, what conclusions for the future do you expect from this meeting?
Those meetings happened already. I think it is cooperation along the lines that has been happening, particularly between Bulgaria and Turkey in recent years, on tightening migration controls, having less migration pressure for Bulgaria and the EU in return for certain advantages. For Turkey, before, even if you remember this incident that was in March 2020, right before the pandemic, when quite a few people arrived at the border with Greece from Turkey. And this was allegedly because this was facilitated by the Turkish authorities. No such gathering of people happened on the Bulgarian border at that time. So there were hypotheses by different analysts that this is really facilitated by the Turkish authorities, and we didn't face the same migration pressure. Even our prime minister at the time was bragging that we have zero migration pressure because we have such good cooperation on migration with Turkey.
So I think we have still time for one more question, which is, I think, quite important, because migration and number of refugees, all this is a result of some processes. It's not happening just so. We know that usually it's a result of war, a result of failed states in particular regions of the world. I would like to ask you how you evaluate the European Union policy in preventing that refugees and migration at such scale is happening in these states. Are they contributing in democratization of countries in, let's say, Middle East or Africa, or it is rather left alone and then only turned into the security issue, protection of border and regulation of migration, in your opinion?
In my opinion, again, with the EU policy in this field runs in opposite directions. On one hand, the EU is one of the biggest humanitarian donors in the world. On the other hand, we have evidence that the EU tries to outsource the migration issue through some informal agreements with third countries. One notable example is the informal, somewhere formal cooperation, for example, with the Libyan Coast Guard in terms of regulating the migration in the Mediterranean, even though we know so many people have lost their lives in the Mediterranean and that the reception conditions in Libya are virtually non-existent. We're talking about detention centers, about slave trade, about really atrocious conditions. For Bulgaria, what we're seeing for this year, for example, is that still the most asylum seekers come from Syria, 10 years after the conflict started, and from Afghanistan. Unfortunately, even with the changed situation in Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban regime, what we're seeing still in the asylum procedure is that there's not enough sensitivity to the human rights violations that are happening in Afghanistan. For example, I'm aware of a couple of applications where the change of regime and the human rights violations that followed were dismissed as a new circumstance on which an asylum seeker from Afghanistan can submit a new application. And in our view, this was very much a major change of circumstances that should warrant the possibility for someone to submit a new application for asylum even after a final rejection. Very few cases we're still seeing where the court is willing to acknowledge human rights violations in Iran, for example. So even our judicial authorities, our asylum authorities are still not sensitive enough to the contexts and the human rights contexts in the different countries. Syria is particularly notable example because we have been receiving large numbers, but to be receiving so many people, even so many years after supposedly the conflict and some restoration work, even limited, it is very telling that not enough is being done to recover the situation in this war-torn country. What we are seeing from the asylum seekers that are arriving now, as opposed to those that arrived at the beginning of the conflict, is that the medical system there, the educational system, are completely in shambles. I'm speaking to colleagues who are telling me, in the beginning of the conflict, people arrived who were writing with very beautiful calligraphy. Now we're facing people who are virtually illiterate. Very rare diseases that are preventable, like polio, are returning amidst the kids. So this is very, very sad indication that we are not doing enough to help people not leave in the first place or stay in areas that have been they have been affected by conflict. I think also the very abrupt withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan very much precipitated this situation that we're seeing.
Okay, you have partially answered actually my question, because in the end I wanted to ask, have we as Europeans, have we as the members of the European community learned something? I mean, the acceptance of millions of Ukrainian refugees who entered European Union without formalities and without having to prove that they are saving their life was a new experience for European Union. And perhaps we have, are there any signs that the European institutions learned from this, I don't want to say experiment, but from this new experience, a totally different refugee treatment? Can we expect any shift in European migration policy, or rather the acceptance of Ukrainians will be just an exception?
It is a very complex issue, very emotional for me as well, because along with the very warm welcome for the Ukrainians, at least initially, as you know, for the first time ever, the Temporary Protection Directive was activated. This was not done back in 2015 when we faced very large numbers of asylum seekers, but coming from the Middle East, Africa mostly. What we are seeing, unfortunately, is not much of an embrace, but the enforcement of double standards. In Bulgaria, at the highest level, politicians, and not only in Bulgaria, were saying how these refugees are different than the others. And unfortunately, at high level, this discourse continues. That is very sad. It is reinforcing stereotypes that are very unfortunate. My personal hope was that now that the Ukrainians are coming, we will have an opportunity to have a closer look at what is not functioning in the asylum system. Unfortunately, in Bulgaria, with a decision by the chairperson of the State Agency of Refugees, Ukrainians were completely excluded from applying for international protection. They could only get temporary protection. And Foundation for Access to Rights, our organization, is appealing this decision in court. Our argument is that according to EU law, they need to be able to also apply to international protection if they so desire. Even the treatment now, so many months on, of the Ukrainians is not that positive anymore, if it ever was, because the response initially was very favorable also from the people who more easily could identify with these refugees. From the authorities, there has been a lack of a more strategic and ordered approach, especially regarding their accommodation, their stay, their integration. As you may know, many of them were accommodated in hotels along the Black Sea coast. It was clear that this option could not last forever. And now is very present the issue of where do they go? Because many people are still not sufficient enough, or they're sick and vulnerable, so they cannot just find work easily or find a place to live easily. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now in Bulgaria is that the Ukrainians were accommodated in what essentially was built as a detention center. It is supposed to be for 30 days while they're identified and transferred to facilities inside the country. What happened is that many of them just left on their own because the place was so unsuited for little children and for older people and vulnerable individuals.
So I think this is the end of our episode, which was about a very problematic, unfortunately, and very important question of migration. Our guest was Rositsa Atanasova. And I would like to remind everybody that Cross-Border Talks are on YouTube in the form of video, in the form of podcast. You can listen us on SoundCloud and Spotify. We are also on several social media platform like Facebook and Telegram and Twitter. And of course, you can also read our articles about the different topics from the international affairs, from the different regions of Europe and the different regions of the world on our webpage. Everybody have a nice day or evening, and goodbye in the next episode.